Geek Therapy Radio.
Welcome to the Geek Therapy Radio show. I almost called it the Geek Therapy Radio podcast because it is also podcasted. You can find the Geek Therapy Radio podcast in the iHeartRadio app or your favorite podcast player. For instance, I just submitted the podcast to Spotify. I had a lot of requests to put the show on Spotify, so a lot of you already have Spotify. You can find Geek Therapy Radio on Spotify. Whatever your favorite player is, whether it, of course, we prefer the iHeartRadio app here at iHeartRadio, or Spotify, or iTunes, or Pocket Casts, or whatever it is you use, Spreaker. Just search for Geek Therapy Radio podcast and look for the red, white, and black color scheme. That is me. So right off the top of my head, just because it just came to me like a bolt of lightning, I've got a piece of glass in my left big toe. I remembered. I forgot about it all day until just now, bringing my foot up to the little stool portion of this seat, that there is still a piece of glass embedded in the side of my big toe. And I guess I should count my blessings. It's hard to talk. I should count my blessings that it's in the side of my toe, because if it was in the bottom of my toe and I was walking around on it all day, it would have been a lot worse. Here's the thing about a glass splinter, though. It's very, very tough to get out, I've realized, with tweezers. My wife hates feet. She thinks feet are the most disgusting thing. And she was a trooper this morning, and she got the tweezers and was trying to pull the piece of glass out. And the glass was just kind of crumbling in the tweezers because it's a little shard of glass, and that's what happens. And I figured, I had to go to work. So I figured, you know what? My body will just reject the piece of glass at some point. So I'm just going to have to live, I think, with a piece of glass in my toe and be reminded of it every time I bump my toe on something. But I don't know why I'm telling you that. Just running my geek brain here. I've got a piece of glass on my toe. If anybody out there knows, because the piece of glass is probably still going to be in my toe by the time this airs. So if you know how to get glass out of skin, like small shards of glass out of skin, let me know. You can email me at my new email address, by the way, johnny@geektherapyradio.com, JOHNNY @geektherapyradio.com. And I will use this moment as a reminder. I let everybody know on the podcast, I'm going to do a quick reminder once again here in the first segment of the radio show, that big changes are coming to Geek Therapy Radio for the better. But all I can divulge right now to you is to stay tuned to Geek Therapy Radio on social media. So it's on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all that good stuff, YouTube. But I think the best ways are Twitter and Facebook. Just search for Geek Therapy Radio. Once again, always with everything, look for the red, white, and black color scheme, Geek Therapy Radio. And follow me on Twitter and Facebook and around there. And a few of you already have started to trickle in there, and I very much appreciate that. That's where you're going to get the most up-to-the-date news about what's happening with Geek Therapy Radio and the Geek Therapy Radio podcast. The most I can tell you right now is that you should follow me on there so that you don't experience any interruptions in how you get the podcast. So the podcast is going to get better. At the very minimum, it's going to stay the same, but I have every reason to believe it's going to get better. It's going to be so much better this year going into 2021 than it has ever been. But it may be that it doesn't show up. Like when you subscribe to the Geek Therapy Radio podcast, I'll just say that there's a potential that it might be hosted on through a different avenue. So right now we upload it through Spreaker, and there is a possibility that might change here in the next few weeks. So you might have to research for the Geek Therapy Radio podcast. You might notice, hey, why isn't he uploading any new podcasts? You might have to just, kind of refresh it, research for Geek Therapy Radio podcast in your favorite podcast player. So be on the lookout for that. GeekTherapyRadio.com is also a great way to contact me. The contact form right there on the GeekTherapyRadio.com. All the podcasts are on GeekTherapyRadio.com. So here's what I've been tinkering with as we get to the tail end of the first segment here. Yes, I've been tinkering with the glass splinter in my toe, but I've touched on this kind of in the past, where one of the great parts about being a geek and being a geek about many different things is that we are never bored, since we have so many fascinations and different facets of what we are intrigued by, that when you like a lot of different things, you have this endless circle. You keep circling around to these things that you're interested in, and every once in a while, you kind of interject a new kind of slice of the pie into that circle. But it's always a full circle. For instance, I am a massive geek about classic cars. I'm a massive geek about retro computers, modern computers, video games, aviation. I already said retro computers, Raspberry Pi. All sorts of different things. So I've circled back around to Raspberry Pi, and for the past day or so, I've been tinkering with my Raspberry Pi 4 gigabyte model, my Raspberry Pi Zero W, which I still think, please, Eben Upton. I've talked to Eben Upton on my show. I've talked to Eben Upton, who's the CEO and founder of the Raspberry Pi Foundation, to update the Raspberry Pi Zero, maybe a Raspberry Pi Zero 2, at least with the dual core. There are reasons, mostly manufacturing reasons, why that's easier said than done, because one of the points of the Raspberry Pi Zero is to reach a sub $10 price point. Sometimes you can find Raspberry Pi Zero Ws even for $5. And adding a dual core chip, it adds extra cost, and it's hard to reach that sub $10 price point once you go that route. It's not just a difficulty with a PCB. It is and it isn't, but it mostly boils down to cost. But Raspberry likes to surprise us, so who knows? Maybe we'll see an updated Raspberry Pi Zero 2, which sounds really weird, in the future. I hope we do. But I've been tinkering around with that, and I'll keep talking about that going into the next segment here, because I'm out of time. Really, the point I just want to make sure I get to concerning the Raspberry Pi is to let you know what my favorite operating system is for the Raspberry Pi, since that's what I'm tinkering with right now. That's what's on my mind right now, is the Raspberry Pi. And I do want to talk about Nvidia also. The shadiness happening at Nvidia, especially with their graphics cards, is enough to make a geek blood boil. But let's talk more about the Raspberry Pi, my favorite Raspberry Pi OS, and Nvidia when we come back. More Geek Therapy Radio coming up. Make sure you visit geektherapyradio.com. Send me a line. My new email, johnny@geektherapyradio.com. That's JOHNNY @geektherapyradio.com. And make sure you subscribe to the podcast and the social media. Look for the red, white, and black color scheme, and that's it. More Geek Therapy Radio coming up. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. You've got your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger. I'm going to remind you every segment that you need to follow. Well, I hope you will follow Geek Therapy Radio on social media, specifically Twitter and Facebook, because there are some big changes coming to Geek Therapy Radio in the very near future, and I don't want you to miss out. So if you're subscribed to the Geek Therapy Radio podcast, in your favorite podcast app, whether it's the iHeartRadio app or Spreaker or iTunes or Spotify. Geek Therapy Radio is now on Spotify. I want you to be sure you're subscribed to the social media so you don't miss a beat, because there's going to be a change in the next coming weeks of how I upload podcasts. It's going to be a different provider, and that means that if you subscribe to Geek Therapy Radio podcasts, it might just disappear one day from your subscribed podcast lists, or it may not be getting updated. And you might think, I wonder what's happening. Is Johnny stopped doing podcasts? No. Just remember what I'm telling you right now, what I've told you in the past podcast, that there can potentially be a service interruption if you don't research for Geek Therapy Radio podcast in the coming weeks. But I'll let you know when that happens. In the last podcast or the last upload, whatever I do, I will let you know that, hey, this is the last one that is hosted by this service, so make sure that next week or in the next couple weeks you redo a search again for the Geek Therapy Radio podcast. The color scheme's not going to change. The backlog of shows, as far as descriptions and titles and things, I got to decide what I need to do, or what I can do with that. And you might think, well, Johnny, you have a few dozen podcasts, just re-upload them and redo. I have hundreds, over 4 podcasts, 400 that I'm going to potentially lose the descriptions and the titles for. And it's unfeasible. It would take me weeks probably, but who knows? I may do some sort of like archive download, just download all the podcasts yourself, like several gigs of past audio. Who knows? No promises, but I'm just letting you know I got to figure out what to do from there. But in order for you not to miss a beat of Geek Therapy Radio, make sure you follow me on social media, because I'll tell you there, and also tell you in the final, not the final, but the last upload that I do, the last podcast that I do through this provider. I'll let you know what's going on there, but just kind of keep on your radar. Going to keep reminding you in these final podcasts on this provider to stay tuned. And if you notice that there's no more podcast for me, what's happening in Geek Therapy Radio, you might just have to search for it again and resubscribe. But we'll get to that point. The last thing I want to say about that is I know that means I'm going to lose most of my base. And it's not gonna be because you hate Geek Therapy Radio. It's just gonna be because things fall through the cracks. You might not notice that there has been a change to Geek Therapy Radio. It just might not show up in rotation anymore, and you won't notice. So it's just kind of a clerical thing. I know that I'm going to lose most of you. Or I should say that I'm mentally prepared, emotionally prepared to lose most of you and kind of build it up again. But as will be revealed very shortly here, it is for very good reason. And Geek Therapy Radio Podcast 2.0 is going to be very, very, very good. I can assure you that. Okay, so I was talking about the Raspberry Pi, and I want to also put a pin in Nvidia for a moment. But Raspberry Pi, all I wanted to really get to with the Raspberry Pi discussion here is that I think as of now, or for now, I've decided on my favorite operating system. Maybe a better way to put that is this. I figured out my favorite operating system on the Raspberry Pi for now, because it is subject to change. That's one of the amazing things about the Raspberry Pi, is that it is so completely and beautifully open source that you can do, and developers can do, absolutely freaking anything that they can imagine with the Raspberry Pi. So my favorite operating system right now is called Twister OS. And there are probably several of you listening right now who are, chin deep into the Raspberry Pi ecosystem, and just you're geeks about the Raspberry Pi, who are just kind of shot your hands in the air. Yes, Twister OS. I, for one, think that Twister OS needs more publicity. And no, I haven't talked to anybody at the Twister OS team. I have not reached out to them. I have not seen that they want more publicity. I have no freaking idea. I can just tell you that it can grow authentically, through word of mouth, if it's a good product, so to speak. Even though Twister OS is free, you don't pay for it at all. It's a free open source operating system, like every other operating system on Raspberry Pi. But I just like it so much that I want to tell you, the audience, about it. So if you have a Raspberry Pi and you like to tinker with it from time to time, and you've been thinking about something else to do with it, a new project with it, whatever, I highly suggest giving Twister OS a shot. And I will include a link to the website in the podcast description where you can download it. I will say right now, though, that I believe as of recording right now, that Twister OS only works for Raspberry Pi 4 and above. So Raspberry Pi 4 and any kind of RAM variant. So I got a Raspberry Pi 4 with 4 gigabytes of RAM. You can get a Raspberry Pi 4 with 8 gigabytes of RAM. You can also get the Raspberry Pi 400, which is the keyboard all-in-one computer based on the Raspberry Pi 4, which I still want so badly. I still want it so badly, the Raspberry Pi 400, and I just haven't, I don't know why I just really haven't pulled the trigger on it. It is less than $100, and the main reason I want it, and one reason why I haven't pulled the trigger on it, is that I already have a Raspberry Pi 4. I mean, that's just kind of what has kept me from doing it, is that effectively, as far as usability, I've already got a Raspberry Pi 4 with Bluetooth keyboard and USB keyboards and all I need to do it, and effectively, it's not going to be any different as far as how I use it. But the real reason that I do still want the Raspberry Pi 400, and why I will definitely be getting one at some point in the near future, is that it reminds me, and I know a lot of you are already thinking this, it reminds me of the Commodore 64. and other keyboard-based computers from the late 70s and early 80s. The Apple II, I have my Atari ST, 520 STFM. Atari made STs that are 1024 ST, 520 ST, different variants of the Atari ST, but it's kind of, it's an all-in-one computer basically. And the Raspberry Pi 400, it kind of plays perfectly into that nostalgia. It's modern, don't get me wrong, the keyboard's modern. One of the things that is frustrating, and we'll talk about Nvidia in the next segment, I can already tell. One of the things that's personally frustrating to me about the Commodore 64, which I love the Commodore 64. Don't get me wrong, it has a very close place in my heart. I keep it predominantly displayed in my man cave, and I have accessories for it that allow me to hook it up to all sorts of different kind of monitors and different setups. I love the Commodore 64. That said, one of the frustrating parts about it is that maybe I'm not just speaking for myself, and I know I'm not just speaking for myself. There seems to be this kind of groundswell in people getting into retro computing and trying to fit retro computers into their daily productivity because there's so many less distractions when you're using a retro computer that can't connect to Facebook and can't connect to YouTube to distract you. So I will just say that one of the issues you fall into, one of the pitfalls, one of the challenges is that if you're using a retro computer, let's say like the Atari 520 ST or the Atari ST, the keyboard layout is great for word processing, and you can even get Word 1.0 or Microsoft Write or Microsoft Word 1.0 for the Atari ST and type to your heart's content. I mean, it's Microsoft Word. It looks effectively and you use it effectively just like you use any modern version of Microsoft Word. The problem is that, yes, you can save the document to a floppy drive of the Atari ST, but that floppy disk is not directly compatible with a modern system. Even if you have a USB floppy drive, there was some compatibility between the Atari ST and a PC compatible as far as floppies go, but it was only one way. And I know from experience that it does not work to where I can type up a document on my Atari ST, save it to a disk, and then pop it into my USB disk drive on my Ryzen 3900X build and then be able to open that document in a modern version of Word. You can't do that. And that's one of the pitfalls. And that's kind of one of the challenges. The other challenge is the keyboard layout. The Commodore 64 is not good as a word processor. And I'll wrap up that thought in the next segment. More Geek Therapy Radio coming up. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. You've got your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger. Be sure you are following Geek Therapy Radio in your favorite podcast app, of course. We prefer iHeartMedia app here at iHeartMedia. At iHeartRadio. But if you're following on Spotify or Spreaker or iTunes, anything like that, make sure that you are following there. But more importantly right now, because things are coming up in the next few weeks, make sure you're following Geek Therapy Radio on all social media. Mainly Geek Therapy Radio on Facebook and Twitter. And more mainly Twitter, because that's how I can kind of most directly interact with y'all. I can do it on Facebook too, but either or, just search for Geek Therapy Radio on Facebook and Twitter and look for the red, white, and black color scheme, and that's me. Geek Therapy Radio is always going to be the red, white, and black color scheme. So Geek Therapy Radio on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, just look for the red, white, and black color scheme. That's how you can be sure that it is Geek Therapy Radio with your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger. Okay, in the last segment, I was talking about retro computing and how a lot of us some of us who get in retro computing, we have the what would you call it? The brazen naivete of trying to incorporate retro computing into our daily productivity. And for good reason, as I mentioned in the previous segment, it's because it reduces distractions. You can type things and do word processing, for instance, without the distractions of Facebook and YouTube and social media and things to distract you. Also, I mean, there's kind of a little caveat to that, is that, you need the internet for doing research. A lot of the times when you're typing up something, you have the document in one window and then the internet on the other one, and you're doing research while you type. So at the end of the day, even if you're using a retro computer to do your typing, you still have a tablet open or another laptop open or something with the internet, so you can do your research while you're writing. But that being said, of course, there are some use case scenarios where you can be productive and you don't need access to the internet. Maybe you write short stories and you don't necessarily need to have an internet connection all the time. A retro PC can certainly fit that bill to help you type in this scenario and we're just talking about typing in this scenario. You could be doing whatever. You can be using a retro PC for productivity purposes. Now, there are a few things that can get in the way of actual practical day-to-day use of a retro PC in the year 2021 as of recording, not the least of which is, okay, great, you've written that Word document on your Atari ST or whatever, and now you take that floppy disk. That's the first challenge right there, is you can take the floppy disk out of a retro computer. But there aren't too many modern PCs that still have a floppy drive in it. Yes, you can get USB to floppy drives adapters, and they are very cool. They are limited, though. I would say that, for instance, a lot of USB to floppy drives don't support 720 kilobyte disks or single-sided disks. It's kind of single density. It's only 1.44 megabyte high density disks that usually these USB external floppy drives support. Then you run into the issue of, well, if that can't run it, then you need kind of an in-between PC. And I will say right now that a Pentium 4 Windows XP era PC is probably a good go-between. Let's say you are doing your retro computing on an old 286 and you're running Windows 3.0 or 3.1 and you have Office 1993. What is it? What's the last version of Office? Like 6.0 or 5.0 that would work on a 386? Because I'm not sure it would work on a 286. Either way, you've got a retro PC that you can copy your files to a floppy disk, and you can't just take that floppy easily and put it into a modern system. You need kind of a go-between computer. So basically it's a computer that has a floppy drive and a USB port. So Pentium 4 Windows XP era machine would be a good go-between, because most all of them still have floppy drives, and most all of them have USB ports. So you could take your floppy disk that you take from your old 1986 286 computer, put that floppy disk into that Windows XP machine, copy those Word documents from the floppy disk to the USB drive, take the USB drive out and put it into your modern Windows 10 PC, load it up into modern Windows Office 365, and off to the races you go. Now, I know what a lot of you are thinking right now who are not into retro PCs. You're thinking that this sounds like pulling freaking teeth, that it is so not worth just sitting down on a modern PC, your modern laptop, and just writing a document, just opening up Microsoft Word or LibreOffice or whatever, and just writing. What is the deal with these geeks who use the retro PCs to actually try to get more work done, get real work done, because it seems like it's just creating more work? You know what? I'll tell you exactly why we do that, why we go through this process. Because life is short. And I know you might think, well, yes, life is short. So why are you adding all these extra steps into productivity? Life is short. You need to stop and smell the roses. You know, there's things that kind of feed the spirit, and part of it is feeding the nostalgia, but also part of it is just the weight, you know, of the modern technology. It is easy, but it's so fast paced, and there's so much to distract you. And it's just nice to kind of slow down. And when you're more deliberate in your work, that's kind of also what it forces, is being more deliberate with your work. It's the difference between snapping 1,000 pictures with your cell phone, 100,000 pictures with your cell phone, and going to analog photography where you're limited to 24 shots on a roll. You focus a lot more on composition and making each shot count and each shot good and each shot the best it can be when you're limited to 24. And you can't even instantly see what you've shot. You have to get it developed. You have to pay a lot more attention to making it good with the limitations. And that's part of the reason why retro PC enthusiasts like to incorporate retro PCs into the workflow. The other reason, and I will relate to the people who don't understand retro PCs and what I'm talking about, it sounds stupid, old cars. Old cars are terrible by modern standards. Absolutely terrible by modern standards. Yet, we love, those of us who like old cars, love driving old cars because they are terrible, because it reminds you, yes, a part of it's nostalgia. Maybe this is the car that your dad brought home when you were 12 years old in 1972 and it's your first Mustang and this is what you grew up in or whatever. It brings back those memories, but also with modern cars, modern technology. For instance, my daily driver is a 2017 Chevy Bolt. It's an EV. It's an electric car. But that just makes me appreciate so much more when I drive my 1983 DeLorean, or while I still have it, my 2010 Audi S5 with a 6-speed manual and small block V8. It makes me appreciate the older stuff. This modern stuff makes me appreciate the older stuff, and I feel way more in tune with what I'm doing, especially with driving when I drive that 1983 DeLorean where nothing is power assisted. Nothing is, there's no Bluetooth, there's no Google Maps in there, there's no Android Auto or Apple CarPlay or anything like that. There's no heads-up displays, there's no rear-view cameras, there's no 360 cameras, there's no lane keeping assist, there's no freaking cruise control in it. It makes you completely part of the driving process. There's no power steering. I can drive over a fly's, well, I was going to say something phallic. I can drive over something very small and feel it in my hands through the steering wheel. I know that if there's a problem with the DeLorean through the ball of my foot on the accelerator, I can feel it. I can feel the engine's doing something a little bit off through the ball of my foot. And that's not something you get with modern technology, with modern cars that are so completely detached from the actual experience of driving. And that's a good way to put it. With retro computers, you feel way more attached to the word processing in this case than you do with a modern computer that corrects everything for you. You don't have to be a good writer. You don't have to have good grammar. You don't have to have good syntax. It's all done for you. You can mash on the keyboard like a monkey and have it compose a recognizable sentence for you. I hate Grammarly. Oh my gosh. I did not know I was going to get so worked up about this stuff. That service Grammarly, that not only, it's not even a spell checker. It suggests ways to make the sentence flow better and be more impactful. To me, that's plagiarism. Absolute plagiarism. If I was an English professor and I came in the assignment turned in to me that I can completely tell is not the verbiage that the student uses in class, failure, F. I would bring down their entire grade, a letter grade, if they use a process like Grammarly. Because at no point in time does modern technology and word processing especially teach you how to get better or motivate you to be better versus old technology and old cars, which you have to get good to be good. More Geek Therapy Radio coming up. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. You've got your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger. Make sure you follow Geek Therapy Radio on Twitter and Facebook. Just make sure that you look for the red, white, and black color scheme, and that's me. Search for Geek Therapy Radio. Also, my new email address is very simple. Johnny, Johnny, @geektherapyradio.com. geektherapyradio.com. That is a way to get at me directly. And I'll remind you, whether you go to geektherapyradio.com and fill out the contact form or just email me directly, Johnny@geektherapyradio.com, it's not a mailing list thing. It does not put you on any sort of mailing list. It's literally just to talk to me, just to tell me what your geek thing is, or ask a question, or strike a conversation, whatever. There's a guy, I've mentioned him more, frequently on the show. Well, frequently as far as mentioning listeners go. Anderson, down there in South America, who it's my fault, partly my fault, that I got him into cassettes, recording old cassettes and restoring old cassette players and things. And he says it's one of the most gratifying, satisfying hobbies that he's ever gotten into. And I hope he's okay with me sharing that. And it's true. I love old cassettes. I love repairing cassette machines and Walkman on my YouTube channel, Geek Therapy Radio on YouTube. Again, red, white, and black color scheme. I have a video where I put a new belt on an old Walkman, an old Sony Walkman cassette player. That if you have an old cassette player, you come across an old cassette player in a pawn shop or wherever, and it doesn't work, 9 times out of 10, it's just that the belt is melted off or rotten or snapped or whatever. And it's fairly simple to fix. So anyways, geektherapyradio.com. Just you can go there to get in touch with me. You can email me directly, Johnny@geektherapyradio.com. But also the social media, Geek Therapy Radio on Facebook and Geek Therapy Radio on Twitter. Look for the red, white, and black color scheme, and that's me. Very important updates coming in the next few weeks. I know if you're just listening to the podcast version of this, I'm just repeating this ad nauseum, but I have to say this over and over for the radio broadcast because I never know when people are tuning in. There are very important announcements coming up concerning Geek Therapy Radio. So if you don't want to experience an interruption in the Geek Therapy Radio podcast, make sure you are following me on the social media so I can keep you up to date. If you do experience an interruption, just search for again Geek Therapy Radio podcast, and you'll stay up to date with me. Okay. So in the last segment, before I went off on this big rant about Grammarly and word processing and why we still like using old things sometimes, old classic cars, old classic computers, because it kind of forces you to pay attention to what you're doing and authentically get good at something rather than have spell checking and a safety net constantly. I'm really not going to get too much distracted on this because I want to talk about Nvidia for a moment. But in my EV, in my Chevy Bolt, there's lane keeping assist. It's not even autopilot. It's not self-driving. It's just lane keeping assist. I keep it off because I hate it. I understand its usefulness. If I was on a road trip, I probably would keep it on because it's a safety feature. But there's so many of these driver aids. Have you noticed drivers getting any better? And I'm really not going to go off on this tangent. Have you noticed drivers getting any better in modern times? No, they've only been getting worse. Similarly, though, injuries and deaths have been going down because we drive around in these cocoons of airbags and things like that. But the actual driving has gotten so bad because people no longer have to get good at it. The car does so much of it for you now. I would say in the United States, at least in Houston, maybe 25% of people, maybe a little bit more, 25% of people don't use their blinkers. And that's my pet peeve. And it's kind of like, how lazy and or stupid can you be not to use a blinker to even signal something as simple as a lane change? You're either lazy or stupid. There's no in between. There's literally no in between. It's either laziness or stupidity. And I don't care if you're driving around right now and you're the type of moron that doesn't use a turn signal or a blinker. That's what you're telling the world, is that you're a moron. And then I have to remind myself, Johnny, that is so not what your show is about. That is not what you are about. You preach this message of love at the end of every show. But I'm a human being, and I have to ask myself, and the reason I'm telling you this right now is because it keeps me accountable. What I try to think of every time I see somebody, I almost said moron, change lanes in front of me or behind me or whatever, not using a signal, I have to remember, I don't know what their life is. I can't just assume that they're an idiot. Maybe they have a special needs parent or something. Someone's going through cancer. Maybe they have cancer. Maybe they're going through something terrible, and it just kind of slipped their mind. Or they've given up for one reason or the other, and using a turn signal it's just too much to ask of them. I have to picture them like that. Otherwise, I get furious because I just can't understand the malaise that must exist in one's mind not to lift a knuckle to signal a lane change. And that's just me complaining. Maybe that's just me in Houston, because I don't care about this stuff when I go to South America or Europe or elsewhere. Because if you go to South America and other countries like that, cars don't come with turn signals. There's no way. You drive around in Peru, you will never see a blinker, ever. And that's fine to me. To me, that's fine, because that's just like everyone knows what's going on. I mean, that's just kind of what's given. But in the United States, it's supposed to be kind of a land as far as traffic is concerned of rules and guidelines that everyone keep. We have lanes here in the United States, and it's kind of this understanding you're supposed to be cordial to fellow drivers, and it's like not using a blinker is just kind of telling the whole world that maybe you're not that bright, and you for certain don't care about anybody else around you. So I got to remind myself, maybe I don't know what that person's going through. Maybe they don't use a blinker because they're just distracted or they have cancer or something terrible. Anyways, Nvidia. I need to vent about Nvidia a little bit, because it's rare that I'm in the market for a new graphics card. But I am in the market for a new graphics card now. I will need one in the very near future. And I'm looking at getting, I know this is a fool's errand, and you'll know when I say it, a 3080 or preferably an RTX 3090. It's like I'm in the market for one. I'm going to need a high-powered graphics card for what is going to occur in the near future. Can I buy one? Can I buy a 3080 or 3090 for retail price? Absolutely freaking not. I can't do it. And partly it's because of the pandemic, yes, in manufacturing, putting a toll, a strain on Nvidia, and even on the 6900 XT from AMD. Graphics cards right now are just at a premium, and the supply chain of graphics cards right now is strained, to say the least. I know a lot of you PC gamers out there and you content creators out there know exactly what I'm talking about. This is nothing new. AMD and Nvidia, but mostly Nvidia, is suffering from this. Except that here's where the venting comes in, and why I'm so angry at Nvidia. Yet I need an NVIDIA card because it works best with DaVinci Resolve, which is my video editor of choice. Not only is there a supply chain issue, but NVIDIA has set aside $175 million worth of inventory to sell cards to digital currency miners, specifically Ethereum miners. That means content creators and gamers who want to buy the cards can't buy the cards because those cards are already spoken for, because Nvidia has already done a backroom deal with digital currency miners. So why Nvidia, why did you even tell us that you were going to release these cards back in October, September of 2020? Why, if we can't even get them? And the scalpers and price gougers, you want a 3080. A 3080 is supposed to be what, around $700 or $800, under $1,000 for sure. Go on eBay and Amazon and try to get an RTX 3080 for under $2,000. Try to do that. Try to. The scalping is ridiculous. And I understand supply chain issues during a pandemic, but it's just so insulting, and it's a giant middle finger to the consumer when Nvidia sets aside $175 million worth of inventory to sell directly to Bitcoin operations or Ethereum digital currency operations. It's like, I'm sitting here with the money. I want to give it to you, but you're not supplying me with it. Anyways, please remember all this ranty stuff. You are worthy of love. You are worthy of giving love. Even you who doesn't use your blinker, you are worthy of love. You are worthy of receiving love, and you are worthy of your own self-respect. GeekTherapyRadio.com, Geek Therapy Radio across all social media, red, white, black color scheme. I will talk to y'all so soon. We're all geeks about something. Geek out.